Woman mocks single dad's thrift store clothes. Her husband recognizes his former business partner. She laughed at the man she thought was broke. But when her husband froze in shock, the room went silent because the man in the thrift store jacket once built their entire fortune. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The bell above the thrift store door chimed as Daniel and Noah stepped out into the rain. Their footsteps echoed on the wet sidewalk, water splashing beneath their shoes. Noah pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, his face tight with anger. "Dad, you shouldn't let people talk to you like that," Noah said, his voice trembling. "That woman had no right." Daniel placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Some folks judge books by their covers, son. We can't control that. But we can control how we respond." Noah shook his head, droplets of rain flying from his dark hair. "But it's not fair. You work harder than anyone I know." A sad smile crossed Daniel's weathered face. "Life rarely is fair, but being bitter about it only hurts us more." He squeezed Noah's shoulder. "Come on, we'll try the store over in Madison next weekend." Inside the thrift store, Emily Warner stood frozen, her earlier smugness replaced by an uncomfortable warmth in her cheeks. The quiet dignity in Daniel's response had struck something in her she couldn't quite name. She watched through the rain-streaked window as father and son walked away, their shoulders pressed together against the weather. "Emily?" Her friend Susan touched her arm. "Are you all right?" Before Emily could respond, she heard a sharp intake of breath behind her. She turned to see her husband, Richard, standing in the doorway. His face had gone ashen, his usual confident bearing replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Richard?" Emily frowned. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Richard Warner didn't respond. Immediately, his eyes were fixed on the retreating figures of Daniel and Noah, now barely visible through the rain. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the handle of his umbrella. "It can't be," he whispered. "Daniel Hayes?" The name fell into the quiet store like a stone into still water. Emily's eyes widened. "You know him?" Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Know him?" His voice was rough. "Emily, that man helped me build everything we have." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Emily processed this information. She thought of her cutting remarks, of the quiet strength in Daniel's response, and felt shame bloom fresh in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, though something in her didn't want to hear the answer. Richard finally tore his gaze from the window and looked at his wife. The pain in his eyes made her step back. "Daniel Hayes was my business partner. 20 years ago, we started Hayes and Warner Builders together." He ran a shaking hand through his silver hair. "He was the best man I ever knew." Emily's friend Susan quietly excused herself, sensing the private nature of the conversation. The store clerk busied herself reorganizing a rack of sweaters, though her ears were clearly tuned to their exchange. "But if he was your partner," Emily said slowly, "why is he shopping in thrift stores? Why haven't I ever met him before?" Richard's face contorted with what looked like guilt. "It's complicated, Emily. There was an accident. His wife and daughter." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "We should go home. There's a lot I need to tell you." Emily nodded numbly, her mind replaying her cruel words from earlier. She thought of Daniel's calm response about kindness, and how it had made her feel small despite her expensive clothes and carefully maintained appearance. As they walked to their car, she watched Richard's face. In 20 years of marriage, she'd never seen him look so shaken. Her husband was always the picture of confidence, the successful businessman who had built an empire from nothing. But now, watching him stare through the rain in the direction Daniel had gone, she saw something else, something that looked very much like regret. They climbed into their Mercedes in silence. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel, but he didn't start the engine. Rain drummed on the roof, creating a cocoon of white noise around them. "Richard?" Emily prompted gently. He took a deep breath. "I saw his son with him. Noah, right?" Emily nodded. "He looks just like his mother." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "Sarah was. She was one of the kindest people I've ever known. She used to bring lunch to all the crew members, knew every one of their names, their kids' names." Emily reached over and touched her husband's arm. "What happened, Richard?" He turned to look at her, and in the gray light of the rainy afternoon, he suddenly looked older than his years. "I made a choice, Emily, a choice that I've regretted every day since." He paused, then added quietly, "And seeing them today, seeing Daniel in those worn clothes, knowing his son has to shop at thrift stores." He shook his head. Maybe it's time I finally faced what I did. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the world in shades of gray. Inside the car, Emily sat in silence, watching her husband wrestle with ghosts she hadn't known existed until today. She thought about the man in the thrift store, how he'd maintained his dignity in the face of her cruelty, and wondered what story lay beneath the surface of his quiet strength. Richard finally started the car, the engine purring to life. As they pulled away from the curb, Emily caught one last glimpse of the thrift store window, where a sign advertised second chances at second-hand prices. The irony wasn't lost on her. The dining room of the Warner mansion felt unusually quiet that evening, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Crystal glasses sparkled like captured starlight under the chandelier's warm amber glow, and the rich aroma of pot roast mingled with rosemary and thyme filled the spacious room. The mahogany table stretched between them like an ocean, its polished surface reflecting the flickering flames from the silver candelabra Emily had insisted on lighting for their Tuesday dinner. Emily sat at one end of the long table, her silk blouse pristine and her silver jewelry catching the light as she gestured animatedly. She chattered about centerpieces and guest lists for her upcoming charity fundraiser, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone accustomed to organizing social events. Her words flowed like water over stone, filling the silence with talk of floral arrangements and seating charts. "I was thinking blue hydrangeas for the tables," she continued, cutting her pot roast into precise, delicate pieces. "The blue would complement the ivory tablecloths beautifully, don't you think?" "Mrs. Peterson suggested roses, but honestly, they're so ordinary. Everyone uses roses. I want something that will make people stop and notice." "Richard, are you even listening to me?" At the opposite end of the table, Richard barely touched his food. His fork moved mechanically, pushing pieces of roasted carrot around his plate in small, aimless circles. The vegetables had grown cold long ago, their glaze congealing, but he seemed unaware of everything except the thoughts churning behind his distant eyes. His usually sharp business demeanor had crumbled into something hollow and preoccupied. Richard blinked slowly, as if emerging from a deep fog, and looked up from his untouched dinner. The weight of whatever occupied his mind seemed to pull at the corners of his mouth, aging him beyond his 58 years. "Sorry, dear, I'm just preoccupied tonight." Clearly. Emily dabbed her lips with the crisp linen napkin, her movements precise and practiced. She studied her husband's face with growing concern, noting the deep furrows across his brow and the way his shoulders curved inward. "You've been acting strange ever since you came home from the office. Is everything all right? Did something happen with the Henderson project?" Without answering, Richard pushed back his chair with sudden urgency. The heavy wooden legs scraped against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech that made Emily wince and set her teeth on edge. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room like fingernails on a chalkboard. "I need to check something," he muttered, his voice thick with an emotion Emily couldn't identify. He walked away from the table with quick, uneven steps, leaving his napkin crumpled beside his barely touched plate. The study was Richard's sanctuary, a masculine refuge where the outside world couldn't intrude. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with leather-bound books, classics, and business texts arranged with meticulous care and framed awards documenting decades of professional achievement. The rich scent of old paper and leather polish filled the air, usually bringing him comfort. Tonight, however, the room felt oppressive, as if the weight of memory had settled into every corner. He went straight to his massive oak desk, bypassing the neat stacks of contracts and correspondence that usually demanded his attention. With trembling fingers, he pulled open the bottom drawer, the one he rarely touched anymore. Beneath old tax documents and forgotten business cards lay a photo album wrapped in tissue paper, its burgundy leather cover coated with a fine layer of dust that spoke of years of neglect. The spine crackled like autumn leaves as he opened it, the sound sharp in the quiet room. His hands shook slightly as he turned the pages, past corporate Christmas parties and groundbreaking ceremonies, searching for something specific. Each photograph was a window into a different time, when his face bore fewer lines and his eyes held more hope. There, on the third page, was the photograph that had haunted his thoughts all evening. Two younger men stood grinning beneath a Tennessee summer sky, positioned proudly in front of a modest storefront with weathered brick walls and a large front window. A hand-painted wooden sign reading Hayes and Warner Builders hung above them, the letters slightly uneven but painted with obvious care and pride. The paint was still fresh in the photo, gleaming white against the green trim of the building. The Daniel in the photograph was a different man entirely from the one Richard had glimpsed at the thrift store. This younger Daniel wore a clean red flannel shirt and sturdy new work boots, their leather still unmarked by years of labor. His arm was thrown casually around Richard's shoulders in the easy camaraderie of friendship and shared dreams. Both their faces shone with the kind of pride and hope that only comes from building something meaningful with your own hands. Daniel's smile was broad and genuine, his eyes bright with anticipation for the future they would build together. "Richard?" Emily's voice drifted from the doorway, soft with concern. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she approached, the sound muffled by the thick Persian rug that covered the center of the study. "What are you looking at?" "You've been in here for 20 minutes. He didn't look up immediately, his weathered finger tracing the edge of the photograph with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. The paper was smooth beneath his touch, preserved by years of darkness in the drawer's depths. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2 decades of regret. "Do you remember that man at the thrift store today? The one you—" He let the sentence hang in the air, unable to finish it. Emily's cheeks flushed pink, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. The memory of her cruel words rushed back with uncomfortable clarity. "Oh. Yes. Well, I know I shouldn't have said what I did, but that was Daniel Hayes." Richard's voice caught slightly on the name, as if speaking it aloud gave it power to wound him. "My former business partner." Emily stepped deeper into the study, her heels clicking a nervous rhythm on the floor. She moved with the careful grace of someone entering unfamiliar territory, her usual confidence shaken. "Business partner? But Richard, you never mentioned having a partner. I thought you built the company yourself." 20 years ago, we started Hayes and Warner Builders together. Richard turned the album so Emily could see the photograph clearly, his movements slow and deliberate. The lamplight illuminated the faded colors, bringing the 2 young men to vivid life. Daniel was the best carpenter I'd ever met. He could look at a broken-down house, something everyone else would tear down, and see exactly how to bring it back to life. His hands could work magic with wood and stone. Richard's voice grew warmer as the memories flowed, his eyes softening as he remembered those early days. "I handled the business side contracts, permits, marketing, while he handled the craft. We were perfect complements to each other. I could sell a job, but Daniel could make it beautiful. We were absolutely unstoppable in those days." Emily sank into the buttery leather armchair across from his desk, her designer dress rustling against the soft material. She leaned forward, studying the photograph with new eyes. The easy friendship between the 2 men was evident in every detail, the way they stood close together, the matching pride in their expressions, the comfortable weight of Daniel's arm across Richard's shoulders. "What happened?" she asked, though something in Richard's expression told her she wasn't prepared for the answer. Richard closed his eyes, and pain etched deep lines around his mouth like canyons carved by years of erosion. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves might shatter something fragile inside him. Sarah, his wife, and their little girl, Emma, were driving home from dance practice on a Thursday evening. It was raining, and the roads were slick. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. A drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection of Maple and 3rd, hit them head-on at 40 miles per hour. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of horror that spread through the quiet room. Emily's hand flew to her throat, where her pearl necklace lay warm against her skin, and she felt her breath catch in her chest. Daniel lost them both in one night. Richard continued, his voice growing hoarse with emotion. Sarah died instantly. Emma held on for 3 days in the hospital before. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. "Oh, God," Emily whispered, her voice thick with dawning understanding. She thought of her own comfortable life, her worries about centerpieces and social standing, and felt a wave of shame wash over her like cold water. He wasn't the same after that. Who would be? Richard's voice carried the weight of someone who had watched a friend disintegrate before his eyes. The Daniel I knew, the one who could whistle while he worked and saw beauty in everything that man died with his family that night, what was left was just broken. Richard stared at the photograph, seeing not just the image, but the whole story that came after the slow collapse of a man's world, piece by piece. He started missing meetings, turning down projects that had been our bread and butter. He'd show up to job sites and just stand there, staring at nothing. The company was struggling because we were losing clients, and He trailed off, shame visible in the slump of his shoulders and the way his hands clenched into fists on the desk. The successful businessman who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals seemed to shrink before Emily's eyes. "You what?" Emily prompted softly, though she sensed they were approaching the heart of whatever had been eating at her husband. Richard's next words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for 20 years and couldn't contain them any longer. "I should have helped him. Should have given him time to grieve. Should have carried the business until he could find his footing again. Instead, He shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. "I watched him spiral into depression and debt. I watched him lose weight and stop caring about everything that used to matter to him. And I did nothing. Worse than nothing, I started making decisions without him, taking on projects he would have hated, changing the direction of everything we'd built together." Emily felt her world shift slightly, like a house settling on its foundation. She had always known Richard as decisive and practical, sometimes ruthlessly so, but she had never imagined him capable of abandoning a friend in need. The memory of Daniel's dignified silence in the face of her mockery suddenly took on new meaning. The gentle way he'd spoken to the thrift store clerk, the careful way he'd handled the suit jacket, as if he understood the value of treating others with respect, even when the world had shown him little in return. Her stomach churned with a shame so deep it felt physical, like nausea rising in her throat. What happened to him after that? "He lost everything," Richard continued, his voice barely audible now. Each word seemed to cost him something precious. His family was gone, the business he'd helped build from nothing was slipping away. His house went into foreclosure because he couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. Medical bills from Emma's hospital stay cleaned out whatever savings they had left. He carefully placed his hands flat on the desk, as if anchoring himself to something solid. One day, he just disappeared. Didn't show up to the office, didn't answer his phone. His neighbor said he'd packed everything he could fit in his truck and drove away in the middle of the night. Nobody knew where he went. Nobody heard from him again. Richard carefully closed the photo album, the soft thud of its pages coming together sounding final and absolute. Until today. The elegant dining room suddenly felt suffocating to Emily, its luxury and comfort transformed into something obscene in light of what she'd learned. She thought of her cruel words at the thrift store, how she'd sneered at a man shopping for his son with the careful attention of someone for whom every dollar mattered. The memory of Daniel's threadbare jacket and worn shoes took on new significance, not the marks of laziness or poor choices, but the badges of a man who had lost everything and was still fighting to give his child dignity. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, each word scraping against her throat like sandpaper. "I mocked a man who's lost everything. I made fun of someone who was just trying to help his son look presentable." Richard looked at her across the desk, his eyes heavy with 2 decades of regret and the kind of weariness that comes from carrying secrets too long. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look older and more fragile than she'd ever seen him. "You mocked the best man I ever knew," he said simply, and the words carried the weight of absolute truth. The statement hung in the air between them like smoke, weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to face. Outside their warm, well-appointed home, rain continued to fall on the manicured lawn, with its carefully tended flower beds and automatic sprinkler system. Somewhere in town, perhaps in a small apartment or modest rental house, Daniel Hayes was probably helping his son try on a second-hand suit jacket, making sure it fit properly for whatever occasion required such formal wear. Emily touched the photograph one last time before Richard put it away, her manicured finger tracing the hopeful smiles of 2 young men who had no idea what the future held. She thought of how different those same faces looked, now one weary but dignified in threadbare clothes, carrying himself with quiet grace despite whatever hardships life had thrown at him. The other haunted by choices made long ago, surrounded by material success but empty of the easy joy that had once lit up his features. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions neither knew how to ask and truths neither was quite ready to confront. In the space of one evening, Emily's understanding of her husband and of herself had shifted fundamentally. The comfortable certainties of her world suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass, beautiful but capable of shattering at the slightest touch. The ancient ceiling fan spun lazily above Daniel and Noah's small kitchen table, its wooden blades wobbling slightly with each rotation, barely stirring the humid Tennessee air that clung to everything like a damp blanket. Their modest 2-bedroom apartment, tucked away on the east side of Willow Creek in a weathered brick complex that had seen better decades, showed signs of careful maintenance despite its age, clean windows that Daniel washed every Sunday morning, neatly arranged secondhand furniture that he'd personally refinished, and family photos in mismatched frames that added warmth to the worn cream-colored walls. The kitchen itself was small but functional, with laminate countertops that Daniel had repaired multiple times, and cabinet doors that hung slightly crooked no matter how often he adjusted the hinges. A small herb garden grew on the windowsill, basil, rosemary, and mint that Sarah had planted years ago and that Daniel now tended religiously, their green leaves a splash of life against the faded curtains. Daniel watched as Noah pushed his mac and cheese around his plate, the orange cheese sauce cooling into an end-eye, unappetizing film. The power flickered again, making both of them look up at the dimming overhead light fixture. A simple brass bowl that had come with the apartment and cast harsh shadows across the small room. A stack of unopened bills sat on the counter nearby, their white envelopes like accusations in the uncertain light. Daniel could see the red final notice stamp peeking out from beneath the electric bill. "Maybe we should light some candles," Daniel suggested, trying to keep his tone light and conversational, though his eyes betrayed the worry he was trying to hide. Just in case the power decides to take another vacation. Noah set down his fork with a soft clink against the ceramic plate, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. "Dad, about today at the store." His voice trailed off, and Daniel could see the hurt swimming in his son's brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, full of intelligence and sensitivity. Everyone was staring at us. I could feel them watching, whispering. Daniel reached across the small table, its surface scarred from years of use, and placed his weathered hand on Noah's arm. His fingers, calloused from years of construction work and now volunteer carpentry, were gentle against his son's skin. "Son, what others say about us isn't who we are. What we do when no one's looking, how we treat people when we have nothing to gain, that's who we are." Noah's shoulders slumped, and he stared down at his plate as if the congealing mac and cheese held answers to life's unfairness. But Mrs. Peterson from Debate Club was there. She heard everything that lady said about us being charity cases. What if she thinks less of me now? What if it affects my chances for the scholarship? "And what did Mrs. Peterson see?" Daniel asked gently, leaning forward with the patient expression he'd perfected over years of parenting alone. "She saw us holding our heads high and walking away with dignity. She saw a young man who didn't respond to cruelty with cruelty. That's worth more than any expensive suit or designer label." The power stabilized with a gentle hum, and the familiar drone of their old refrigerator filled the kitchen, a sound that had become as comforting as white noise over the years. Daniel's eyes drifted to the framed photograph on the wall, their old Victorian house, the one he and Sarah had lovingly restored together with their own hands. He could almost smell the fresh paint and sawdust, could almost hear Sarah's laughter echoing through those spacious rooms. The white porch swing where she used to read poetry on summer evenings, her voice carrying on the warm breeze. The garden where their daughter Emma had planted sunflowers that grew taller than her head, their faces always turning toward the light. "I miss them too, Dad," Noah said quietly, following his father's gaze to the photograph that represented everything they'd lost. His voice carried the weight of grief that never quite left, just settled into the background like an old scar that ached on rainy days. Daniel nodded, his throat tight with emotions he kept carefully controlled for his son's sake. "Your mother, she had this way about her. No matter how tough things got, no matter how many bills piled up or how many setbacks we faced, she'd find something beautiful to focus on." He smiled softly at the memory, his face transforming with genuine warmth. "Remember how she used to say grace before dinner? Every single night, no matter what we were eating." Noah's face brightened, the first real smile Daniel had seen from him all day. She always thanked God for something different each time. Even silly things, like puddle reflections after rainstorms, or the way dust sparkled in afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. That's right. Daniel stood and cleared their plates, his movements careful and deliberate, stacking them with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been doing household chores alone for years. "She taught me that gratitude isn't about having everything you want. It's about finding value in what you do have, no matter how small or simple it might seem." Walking to the living room, Daniel picked up another photograph from the mantel, a simple wooden shelf he'd installed himself above their small electric fireplace. The photo showed Sarah in her favorite blue dress, the one with tiny white flowers that brought out her eyes, standing in front of their construction company's first office. It had been nothing more than a converted garage then, but they'd hung a hand-painted sign that read Hayes and Warner Builders with such pride. Her smile in the photo radiated pure joy and pride, the kind that came from watching dreams take their first tentative steps toward reality. "We had just landed our biggest contract," Daniel explained, running his finger along the silver frame's edge, feeling the slight dent where it had been dropped during one of their many moves. The Henderson family's new house, 4 bedrooms, custom kitchen, the works. "Your mother brought us lunch every Friday, said she wanted to make sure we remembered to eat between all the blueprints and client meetings." Noah moved closer, studying the photo with the intensity he usually reserved for his textbooks. "Was that before Mr. Warner became your partner? When it was just you starting out?" Daniel's expression flickered briefly, like a shadow crossing his face, before settling back into its usual calm composure. "Yes, that was the early days. Just me and your Uncle Mike at first, working out of that little garage, dreaming big dreams. Richard came later, when we needed capital to expand." He set the photograph down carefully, his fingers lingering on the frame. "Time for bed, son. You've got that practice debate tomorrow, and Mrs. Peterson will be expecting your best performance." As they walked down the short hallway to Noah's room, Daniel noticed the worn carpet with its faded pattern of small blue flowers, the faded places where he'd patched nail holes in the walls himself with careful precision. Their apartment wasn't much by most standards, but he'd made sure every corner was clean and safe, a real home, even if it wasn't the spacious Victorian they'd once planned to fill with laughter and family gatherings. Noah climbed into bed, the mattress creaking slightly under his weight, and Daniel pulled the thin blue blanket up to his shoulders, just like he used to when Noah was small and afraid of monsters in the closet. The teenager might be 16 now, taller than his father and wise beyond his years, but some habits died hard, and Daniel wasn't ready to give up this simple ritual of care. "Dad?" Noah's voice was sleepy, muffled by the pillow Sarah had embroidered with his initials when he was just a baby. "I'm proud of you, for not getting angry today. I mean, for walking away instead of fighting back. Mom would have been proud too." Daniel's heart swelled with a mixture of love and sorrow so intense it almost took his breath away. "Get some rest, son." He switched off the bedside lamp and was about to close the door when his phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration startling in the quiet apartment. In the hallway's dim light, filtering through the small window at the end of the corridor, he read the text from Tom, the thrift store manager who'd become something of a friend over the past 2 years. "Remember, veterans woodworking class tomorrow at 9. Could use your expertise with the new guys. Johnson's struggling with basic joints, and Martinez wants to try his hand at furniture repair." Daniel leaned against the hallway wall, its surface cool against his back, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. The weight of the day, the humiliation at the store, the stack of bills waiting on his counter, the memories that seemed to press closer in the darkness, it all pressed down on him like a physical thing. But through the fog of weariness, he thought of Sarah's voice, soft and sure, how she'd always say during their darkest moments, "Just take it one day at a time, love. That's all any of us can do. Tomorrow's troubles can wait for tomorrow, one day at a time," he whispered to himself, clutching his phone like a lifeline in the darkened hallway. The words, a prayer and a promise rolled into one. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds as Emily Warner pulled her Mercedes into the thrift store parking lot. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the steering wheel while she gathered her courage. The open sign flickered dimly in the window, and a few early shoppers were already pushing their carts through the entrance. Emily smoothed her cashmere sweater and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, she felt unsure of herself. The memory of yesterday's cruel remarks weighed heavily on her conscience, made worse by Richard's revelation about Daniel's past. The store's bell chimed as she stepped inside. Martha, the elderly clerk from yesterday, raised an eyebrow but offered a polite nod. "Can I help you find anything, Mrs. Warner?" "Actually, I'm looking for Daniel Hayes. Is he here?" Martha's expression softened slightly. "Back room. He's working on furniture repairs this morning." Emily made her way past racks of secondhand clothes and shelves of used books. The backroom door stood partially open, and she could hear the gentle sound of sandpaper against wood. Daniel sat at a workbench, carefully restoring an old wooden chair. Sawdust dusted his shoulders, and his worn flannel shirt had seen better days, but his movements were precise and practiced. He looked up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Warner?" he said quietly, setting down his sandpaper. Something I can help you with? Emily clasped her hands together, fighting the urge to fidget. I came to apologize for yesterday. What I said was cruel and completely uncalled for. Daniel's hands remained steady on the chair's arm. People have bad days. Don't worry about it. His simple dismissal of her behavior made Emily feel even worse. She glanced around the workshop, desperate to keep the conversation going. Do you repair all the furniture here? What needs fixing? He replied, reaching for a different grade of sandpaper. Better than seeing good pieces end up in a landfill. Emily noticed several other projects in various stages of repair. A dresser with a missing drawer, a table with wobbly legs, and what looked like the beginnings of a handmade bookshelf. May I help? She asked impulsively. I don't know anything about furniture repair, but I could sort donations or something? Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a box of donated items. Those need sorting. Anything broken goes on the red shelf, fixable items on the blue. Emily removed her designer jacket and rolled up her sleeves. The box contained an assortment of household items, picture frames, vases, and small decorative pieces. As she worked, she watched Daniel from the corner of her eye. A young man in a wheelchair rolled into the workshop wearing a veteran's cap. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," he called out. "Morning, Jeff," Daniel replied warmly. "Ready to finish that stool?" Jeff's face lit up. "Yes, sir. Been practicing my sanding technique like you showed me," Emily observed as Daniel guided Jeff through the final steps of refinishing a wooden stool. His patience was remarkable, his instructions clear and encouraging. When Jeff struggled with a particular angle, Daniel simply adjusted the work surface to make it easier for him to reach. "My hands shake sometimes," Jeff admitted quietly. "From the meds. That's why we take our time," Daniel responded, his voice gentle. "Wood's patient. It'll wait for us to get it right." As the morning progressed, Emily learned more about Daniel's volunteer work. 3 times a week, he taught basic carpentry, skills to veterans, helping them develop trade skills for future employment. The furniture they repaired went back to the store or to families in need. She watched as Daniel worked with Jeff on the stool, noting how his stern expression softened when the young veteran successfully smoothed out a rough patch. Their quiet conversation drifted across the workshop, talk of progress, of small victories, of plans for future projects. The Daniel Hayes before her now was a far cry from the man she'd smugly judged yesterday. His worn clothes spoke not of failure, but of honest work. His calm demeanor reflected not weakness, but a deep, steady strength. Emily sorted through another box of donations, her expensive manicure collecting dust. She found herself smiling as Jeff proudly held up his finished stool, Daniel's quiet, "well done," bringing a glow of accomplishment to the young veteran's face. "He's nothing like I thought," she whispered to herself, watching Daniel demonstrate proper staining techniques with infinite patience. Emily Warner paced her living room, twisting her pearl necklace between her fingers. "I want to invite them to dinner," she said, watching Richard's reaction carefully. "Daniel and Noah, to make things right." Richard looked up from his newspaper, his face pale. The morning light streaming through their bay windows made him appear older, more tired than usual. "I don't know if that's wise, Emily." "Why not?" She stopped pacing. "You said yourself he was the best man you ever knew, and after how I behaved—" She shook her head, remembering her cruel words at the thrift store. "It's complicated," Richard muttered, folding the newspaper with trembling hands. "There's history there, Emily. Things you don't understand. Then help me understand." She sat beside him on their leather sofa. "You were partners, friends even. What happened?" Richard stood up abruptly, walking to the window. "Fine, invite them, but don't expect miracles." Emily spent the next hour choosing the perfect day, settling on Friday evening. She dressed carefully in a simple blue dress, nothing too flashy, before driving to the address she'd gotten from the thrift store manager. Daniel's apartment building sat in a modest part of town. Paint peeled from the railings, and a few empty flower pots lined the cracked walkway. Emily's heels clicked against the concrete steps as she climbed to the second floor. She hesitated before apartment 2B, noting the worn welcome mat and a small wooden wind chime that looked handmade. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. The door opened, revealing Noah Hayes. He wore a plain white t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair slightly messy. His eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Warner?" He stood straighter, immediately polite despite his obvious surprise. "Hello, Noah," Emily smiled warmly. "Is your father home? He's just finishing up in the workshop." Noah glanced behind him. Would you like to come in? The apartment was small but impeccably clean. A stack of schoolbooks sat on the kitchen table beside a half-finished bowl of cereal. The furniture was mismatched but well-maintained. Emily recognized some pieces as ones Daniel had restored at the thrift store. Dad? Noah called out. Mrs. Warner is here. Daniel emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. Sawdust clung to his shirt, and the scent of fresh wood followed him. He paused when he saw Emily, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Warner, he said quietly. This is unexpected. Emily clasped her hands together. I wanted to invite you and Noah to dinner this Friday, at our home. When Daniel didn't immediately respond, she added, Please, I'd like to make amends properly. Daniel glanced at Noah, who was watching the exchange with poorly concealed curiosity. That's not necessary, he said. We're fine. I insist. Emily took a step forward. Richard, he'd like to see you too. Something flickered across Daniel's face. Pain, perhaps? Or memory? He looked at Noah again, who gave a small nod. If it helps your conscience, I'll come, Daniel finally said, his voice carrying a hint of resignation. 7 o'clock? Emily suggested. I'll text Noah the address. On Friday evening, Emily moved through her kitchen with nervous energy. She'd spent the afternoon preparing everything perfectly. Her best china gleamed on the dining room table, crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the aroma of roast beef filled the air. Richard sat in his study, unusually quiet. When Emily checked on him, she found him staring at an old photograph. They'll be here soon, she reminded him gently. Yes, he said, but didn't move. Emily adjusted the centerpiece one last time. Fresh flowers in her grandmother's silver vase. The table settings were immaculate, each fork and knife precisely placed. She'd even brought out the good napkins, cream-colored linen with delicate embroidery. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 7:15. Emily smoothed her dress, a classic black cocktail number she'd chosen carefully to be elegant but not ostentatious. The pearls at her throat felt heavy. Richard? She called. Please come out now. Her husband emerged from his study, looking distinguished in his gray suit, but with tension evident in every movement. He poured himself a small glass of scotch, his hands less steady than usual. Are you all right? Emily asked, touching his arm. Before he could answer, the doorbell chimed. Emily's heart jumped. She glanced at Richard, who had gone very still, then moved to answer the door. Daniel and Noah stood on the porch, both wearing clean but simple clothes. Noah held a small wooden box, handmade, Emily realized, while Daniel carried a bottle of wine. Welcome, Emily said, stepping back to let them in. Please, come inside. Noah handed her the box. Dad made it, he explained. As a thank you for the invitation, Emily opened it to find an exquisitely crafted jewelry box, its surface smooth as silk. It's beautiful, she breathed. Daniel nodded acknowledgement, then stopped abruptly. Richard had appeared in the foyer. The two men stared at each other, 20 years of unspoken history hanging in the air between them. Emily watched as color drained from both their faces, the weight of the past pressing down like a physical thing. Daniel, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard. Daniel's response was equally quiet. Emily gestured toward the dining room, her finest china waiting to serve a meal that suddenly felt far more significant than a simple apology dinner. The evening sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn of the Warner estate as Daniel's old pickup truck rumbled to a stop in the circular driveway. Noah fidgeted with his borrowed tie, a navy blue hand-me-down from the thrift store that his father had carefully pressed that morning. Remember, son, Daniel said quietly, we're here because forgiveness matters more than pride. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white despite his calm voice. Noah nodded, though his jaw remained tight. I know, Dad, but after what she said at the store, everyone deserves a second chance. Daniel replied, the words carrying the weight of long practice. Emily Warner opened the heavy oak door before they could ring the bell. She wore an elegant black dress that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, but her smile seemed genuine, if nervous. Please, come in. I'm so glad you could make it. The foyer opened into a grand living room with vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. Family photos lined the walls, memories of vacations, celebrations, and milestones that spoke of a life untouched by tragedy. Daniel's eyes lingered briefly on a familiar face in one of the older photos before moving on. Richard stood by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked smaller somehow, diminished despite his expensive suit and commanding presence. "Daniel," he said, his voice rough. "It's been a long time. 20 years," Daniel replied simply. The initial conversation over appetizers was stilted but polite. Emily asked Noah about school, and the teenager gradually relaxed as he discussed his debate team achievements. Daniel watched his son with quiet pride, contributing occasional comments about Noah's dedication to his studies. "The salmon is excellent," Daniel said during a lull in conversation, breaking a moment of awkward silence. Emily brightened. "Thank you. I discovered this recipe at a cooking class in, do you remember that little diner we used to go to, Daniel?" Richard interrupted suddenly, his voice carrying a strange urgency. "The one near our first job site? What was it called?" "Mary's Place," Daniel answered, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. $2 breakfast special every morning. "That's right." Richard swirled his scotch, ice cubes clinking against crystal. "We planned the whole company there, didn't we? On those paper napkins." The air in the dining room grew heavier. Emily glanced between the two men, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "We did," Daniel acknowledged. His calm expression wavered slightly, like ripples disturbing still water. "I've been thinking about those days a lot lately," Richard continued, his words gaining momentum like a boulder rolling downhill. "About the choices I made. The things I never told you." Noah sat up straighter, his young face alert with sudden interest. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. "Richard," she warned softly, but he shook his head. "No, Emily, he needs to know." Richard set down his glass with deliberate care. "Daniel, when I took the company public, it wasn't a sudden decision like I told you. I'd been planning it for months. The paperwork, the investors, all of it happened behind your back." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Daniel's fingers tightened around his fork, the only visible sign of his distress. "I knew you'd never agree," Richard pressed on, words tumbling out now. "You always wanted to keep it small, personal, but I saw the potential for something bigger, so I made sure your name wasn't on the right documents. When we incorporated, He trailed off, unable to finish. "You cut me out," Daniel finished for him, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the silence. "Right before Sarah and Amy's accident, right before I needed the insurance money most." Noah's face flushed with anger. "What?" he demanded, looking between his father and Richard. "Dad, is that why we lost everything?" Emily's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned. The cruel irony of her behavior at the thrift store crashed over her like a wave. "I tried to find you afterward," Richard said, desperation creeping into his voice. "But you disappeared. The hospital bills, the funeral costs, I heard about all of it too late." Daniel placed his napkin carefully beside his plate and stood. His movements were measured, controlled, but his eyes held decades of pain as he looked at his former friend. "I forgave you once in silence," he said quietly. "I won't do it twice without truth." He turned to Emily, inclining his head slightly. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Warner." Noah pushed back his chair and stood, trembling with barely contained emotion. Father and son walked out together, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor, leaving behind a table full of half-eaten food and two people drowning in the consequences of long-buried choices. Emily paced the marble floors of their living room, tears streaming down her face. The remnants of their disastrous dinner, half-eaten food, and abandoned wine glasses still cluttered the dining table behind her. Richard sat slumped in his leather armchair, looking suddenly old and tired in the dim lamplight. "How could you?" Emily's voice cracked. "All these years, you let me. Believe we earned everything honestly." That dinner, watching Daniel's face when you finally told the truth, she pressed her hands against her temples, trying to steady herself. Richard loosened his tie, his hands trembling slightly. "I told myself it was just business, that I had no choice." He reached for the crystal decanter but stopped himself. After Sarah and little Grace died, Daniel, he wasn't himself. Couldn't be. Who would be? He missed meetings, couldn't focus. The company was losing contracts. "So you betrayed him?" Emily's words cut through the air like ice. "I convinced myself I was protecting the company," Richard said, his voice hollow. "Daniel needed time to grieve, I told myself. The public offering would save jobs, secure our future. I had the paperwork drawn up quietly." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I was wrong. So wrong." Emily sank onto the couch, her anger giving way to a deep sadness. It wasn't about saving the company at all, was it? Richard finally met her gaze, shame written across his features. No, he whispered. It was greed, pride. I saw an opportunity when my friend was at his lowest, and I took it. I've carried that guilt every day since. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its sound echoing through the silent house. Emily wiped her eyes, determination replacing her tears. We have to make this right. Emily, no, she cut him off. I won't be part of this anymore. That man has nothing, Richard, nothing, except his dignity and his son. And earlier this week, I tried to take even that from him. She spent the rest of the night planning, barely sleeping. As dawn broke over the hills of Willow Creek, Emily was already dressed and heading to her car. She'd found Daniel's address in the thrift store's volunteer records. The morning air was crisp as she pulled up to the modest apartment complex, paint peeled from the walls, and a rusty swing set creaked in the breeze. She found Unit 2B and knocked. Softly. Daniel opened the door, still in his work clothes from an early morning shift. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of her, but his voice remained polite. Mrs. Warner, please, Emily said quickly. I need to talk to you about starting fresh. Daniel hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was small but immaculately clean. A stack of Noah's school books sat on the kitchen table next to a half-empty coffee cup. I want to help you restart, Emily said, sitting on the edge of their worn couch. A small contracting business, perhaps. Your own company again. I have connections, resources. No. Daniel's voice was firm but not unkind. But you have so much experience, so much talent, Mrs. Warner, Daniel interrupted, leaning against the wall. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm done with that world. The business world, the climbing, the deals, it all feels hollow now. He glanced toward Noah's bedroom door. My boy is what matters. Teaching him right from wrong, showing him how to be a good man, even when life isn't fair, that's my business now. Emily felt tears threatening again. But surely you want more for him? A better life? A better life isn't about money, Daniel said quietly. It's about character, about doing what's right even when it costs you everything. He straightened up. I won't risk becoming bitter chasing after what was taken from me. Noah deserves better than a father eaten up by revenge. Emily stood slowly, understanding but heartbroken. I want to help somehow, she whispered. Then help others, Daniel replied. There are plenty of people at the community center who need it more than I do. She nodded, gathering her purse. At the door, she turned back one last time. I truly am sorry. For everything. Daniel's expression softened slightly. I know. After she left, Daniel checked on Noah, who was still sleeping soundly after his late-night job at the local diner. The morning sun painted patterns across his son's peaceful face. Daniel sat gently on the edge of the bed. I won't let you grow up bitter like I did, he whispered, smoothing Noah's hair back from his forehead. I promise you that. A gentle morning sun filtered through the community center's dusty windows as Emily Warner stepped inside, wearing jeans and a simple blouse instead of her usual designer outfits. The smell of sawdust and fresh coffee filled the air. Daniel Hayes stood at a workbench, carefully measuring wooden planks while two veterans watched intently. Good morning, Emily said, clutching her volunteer badge. Where should I start? Daniel glanced up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Mrs. Warner, didn't expect to see you here. Please, call me Emily. She rolled up her sleeves. And I meant what I said about helping. Daniel nodded toward a stack of paperwork on a nearby desk. Those forms need organizing. Veterans' applications for housing repairs. Emily settled at the desk, sorting through the papers with careful attention. As the morning progressed, she couldn't help but notice how Daniel worked with the veterans. Patient, encouraging, never raising his voice. He showed them how to sand wood properly, explaining techniques with the same quiet dignity he'd shown that day in the thrift store. Around 10, Daniel called for a coffee break. The veterans gathered around a small table, sharing stories and donuts someone had brought. Emily poured 2 cups of coffee and walked over to Daniel, who stood slightly apart from the group. Black, right? She offered him a cup. I noticed that's how you drink it. He accepted with a small nod. Thank you. They stood in comfortable silence until Emily spoke softly. These renovation projects, they're amazing. How did you start them? Daniel's eyes focused on something distant. After Sarah, my wife, passed, fixing things helped me cope. Thought maybe it could help others too. He paused, sipping his coffee. Every broken house is like a broken heart. Both can be rebuilt. I lost my first husband to cancer, Emily shared unexpectedly. Before Richard, sometimes I still wake up thinking Tom's there. Daniel's expression softened. The missing never really goes away, does it? No, Emily agreed. But it changes shape. Over the next few hours, they worked side by side, organizing the renovation schedule. Emily's administrative skills complemented Daniel's practical knowledge. They identified 5 veteran families needing urgent home repairs. We could turn this into a proper program, Emily suggested during their second coffee break. I could help with fundraising, get more volunteers involved. Daniel hesitated. Not sure I'm ready for anything too formal. Just small steps, Emily assured him. One nail at a time, right? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. That's what I tell the guys. As the afternoon wore on, Emily noticed Daniel checking his phone periodically. Everything okay? Noah's debate team results come out today, he explained, pride warming his voice. He's been working so hard. Right then, Noah burst through the door, waving a paper. Dad! Dad! We made it to state finals! Daniel's face lit up with pure joy. He caught his son in a tight hug, laughing. A rich, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. That's my boy! I knew you could do it! Emily watched from her desk, her heart full. Noah's excitement was contagious as he described the competition, gesturing animatedly. Daniel listened with complete attention, his usual reserve melting away as he smiled at his son's success. The veterans gathered around, congratulating Noah. One of them, an older man named Pete, clapped Daniel on the shoulder. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Hayes. Kids got your determination. Emily observed the scene, noting how Daniel's shoulders seemed lighter, how his smile reached his eyes. The man who'd stood so stiffly in her presence weeks ago was transforming before her eyes. In this moment, surrounded by people who valued him for who he was rather than what he owned, Daniel Hayes was truly alive. Later, as the center began to empty for the day, Emily watched Daniel and Noah leave together, still talking and laughing. She gathered her things, thinking about how a man who'd lost so much could still find the strength to pray each morning, to help others, to believe in second chances. He's learning to live again, she thought, smiling as she turned off the lights. Richard Warner sat in his dimly lit office, staring at a stack of legal documents that seemed to mock him. The numbers didn't add up. They hadn't for months. His new business partner, Marcus Fletcher, had been making questionable decisions that were now coming back to haunt them. The phone rang again. Richard let it go to voicemail, just like the dozen other calls from angry investors. Dark circles hung under his eyes as he rubbed his temples. The morning paper lay open on his desk, its headlines screaming about potential fraud investigations into Warner Construction. Mr. Warner? His secretary poked her head in. The lawyers are here again. Richard waved her away. Tell them I'll call back. Once alone, he pulled out an old photograph from his desk drawer, the same one he'd shown Emily. Him and Daniel, young and hopeful, standing in front of their first office. The guilt that had been gnawing at him for weeks grew stronger. He grabbed his car keys. He needed to fix this, and there was only one person who could help. At the community center, Daniel was teaching a group of veterans how to repair cabinet hinges. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease as he demonstrated the technique. The veterans watched intently, some taking notes, others nodding along. Richard stood in the doorway, watching. Daniel's patience, his gentle way of explaining things, it was all exactly as he remembered. 20 years hadn't changed that. Mr. Hayes? Richard's voice cracked slightly. Could we talk? Daniel looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. He turned to his students. Take 5, folks. Practice those measurements we discussed. They walked to a quiet corner of the workshop. The smell of sawdust and varnish filled the air. Richard's expensive suit looked out of place among the tools and wood shavings. Your company's in trouble, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. I've been reading the papers. Richard nodded, his shoulders sagging. Marcus Fletcher, my new partner. He's been cooking the books, hiding losses, making deals that... He shook his head. I should have seen it coming. Why are you telling me this? Because you were always better at seeing through people than I was. Better with numbers, too. Richard met Daniel's eyes. I want to make it right. I want to reinstate you as co-owner and CFO. Daniel's laugh was hollow. You're only here because you need help. Yes, Richard admitted, But not just for me. 300 families depend on that company for their livelihood. Good people who don't deserve to lose everything because of my mistakes. Daniel walked over to his workbench, picking up a piece of sandpaper. He ran it slowly over a rough board edge. You know what I've learned teaching these veterans? Sometimes the strongest things are built from broken pieces. Will you at least look at the paperwork? Richard pulled out a folder. Full reinstatement, equal partnership, everything we should have had 20 years ago. Daniel set down the sandpaper. The last time I trusted you with paperwork, I lost everything. I know. Richard's voice was barely a whisper, and I've lived with that every day since. A young veteran in a wheelchair rolled up to them. Mr. Hayes, should we start on those cabinet doors now? Daniel's face softened. Be right there, Jim. He turned back to Richard. These men and women, they've lost more than either of us ever will, but they show up every day, trying to rebuild their lives. They remind me that bitterness is a choice. He reached for the folder. I'll review it. Not for you, he said firmly. For the people whose jobs depend on this. Relief flooded Richard's face. He extended his hand. Daniel hesitated for a moment before shaking it. Maybe redemption is still possible, Richard muttered, his grip firm but trembling slightly. Daniel Hayes stood in front of the glass doors of Warner Construction, his reflection staring back at him. The building hadn't changed much in 20 years. Same red brick, same brass handles. But he had changed. His hair was grayer now, his face lined with experiences both bitter and sweet. Taking a deep breath, he pushed through the doors. The lobby fell quiet. A young receptionist looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized him from the company photos still hanging in the hall. Mr. Hayes, she said softly, standing. We've been expecting you. The elevator ride to the third floor felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened, Daniel stepped into a world he'd once known by heart. Cubicles stretched out before him, filled with employees who paused their work to watch him pass. Richard's old office, now his office again, waited at the end of the hall. The nameplate still read, Richard Warner. Daniel's fingers traced the letters before he opened the door. Inside, boxes of financial records covered every surface. The company's troubles were evident in the chaos of papers, unsigned contracts, and desperate sticky notes. Daniel set his worn leather briefcase down and got to work. By noon, he'd already identified 3 major problems. The new partner, Marcus Fletcher, had been padding construction bids and cutting corners on materials. Several loyal employees had been underpaid, while executives received bonuses. The company's reputation was suffering. Mr. Hayes? A knock at the door. Tom Peterson, the head foreman who'd been with the company for 15 years, stood there looking uncertain. Got a minute? Come in, Tom. And it's still just Daniel. Tom sat down, his hard hat in his hands. The crew's wondering, are we keeping our jobs? Daniel leaned forward. Tom, I remember when your daughter was born. You called me from the hospital, remember? This company isn't just buildings and balance sheets, it's people. And I'm here to save both. Relief washed over Tom's weathered face. The guys will be glad to hear that. Things haven't been right since. Since I left, Daniel finished quietly. I know, but we're going to fix that. Throughout the afternoon, Daniel met with department heads and reviewed contracts. He canceled Marcus Fletcher's questionable deals and restored proper safety protocols. When the accounting team showed him the books, he spotted the creative mathematics immediately. No more smoke and mirrors, he told them. We build things that last. Our books should be just as solid. Around 3 o'clock, Noah stopped by after school. Seeing his son in a suit and tie, carrying his debate team folder, made Daniel's heart swell. Noah's eyes lit up as he took in his father's new office. This is amazing, Dad, Noah said, running his hand along the mahogany desk. Is that you in that old photo? Daniel walked over to where Noah pointed. The picture showed a younger version of himself and Richard breaking ground on their first major project. Different lifetime, he said softly. You look happy there. I was, but I'm happy now too, just in a different way. As the day wound down, Daniel called a company-wide meeting in the conference room. Nervous faces looked back at him, people whose mortgages and children's college funds depended on their jobs. I know you're worried, he began. Change is scary. But this company was built on honest work and fair treatment. We're going back to those principles. Starting today, all safety violations will be addressed, payment schedules will be reviewed, and every person in this room will be treated with respect. Shoulders relaxed. A few people nodded. In the back, Tom Peterson smiled. We're not just fixing buildings anymore, Daniel continued. We're rebuilding trust. I need every one of you to help me do that. By 6 o'clock, the office had cleared out except for Daniel and Noah, who'd been doing homework in the corner. Daniel shut down his computer and gathered his things. Ready for dinner, son? Noah grinned. Pizza? You read my mind. At home, they sat on their worn couch, a large pepperoni pizza between them. Noah had loosened his tie, and Daniel had rolled up his sleeves. The day's tension melted away as they shared stories and laughed. Noah grabbed another slice. Feels like old times, he said, smiling. Daniel looked around their modest apartment, at the photos of Sarah and Anna on the wall, at his teenage son, who'd grown up too fast. He smiled back. Almost. The community center buzzed with activity as Emily Warner directed volunteers, hanging streamers, and arranging chairs. Her pearl necklace clinked softly as she checked items off her clipboard. The usual thrift store space had been transformed into an elegant gathering hall, with white tablecloths covering the folding tables and mason jars filled with wildflowers serving as centerpieces. The banner needs to go higher on the left, Emily called out, pointing to the hand-painted sign that read Hearts and Homes. Veterans Housing Project Fundraiser. 2 volunteers adjusted the banner while she straightened a stack of donation envelopes. Daniel Hayes walked in through the side door, carrying a wooden display case he'd built to showcase photos of the veterans they'd helped. His work-worn hands carefully set it on the welcome table. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing around him, and for a moment, Emily saw him as he must have been 20 years ago, strong, confident, full of purpose. This turned out beautiful, he said, running his plaz hand along the polished oak frame. Just like everything you make, Emily replied, arranging the photos inside. Each image told a story. Veterans learning carpentry skills, restored homes, families reunited. Are you ready for your speech? Daniel tugged at his collar. He was wearing the suit they'd finally found for him, properly tailored now. I'm better with a hammer than a microphone. Just speak from your heart, Emily said, patting his arm. That's all anyone needs to hear. The hall filled quickly as evening approached. Local business owners, church groups, and families from all over town squeezed into the rows of chairs. Richard Warner sat near the back, his face drawn and tired, but his eyes never left the stage. Emily took the podium first, her voice clear and strong. Welcome, everyone. We're here tonight because this community believes in second chances. We believe in lifting each other up when we fall. She shared stories of the veterans they'd helped, of homes restored and lives rebuilt. Then she introduced Daniel, and the room grew quiet. Daniel walked to the podium slowly, his shoulders straight despite the weight of all eyes upon him. He cleared his throat and looked out at the crowd. 20 years ago, he began, his voice soft but steady, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. My wife and daughter in a car accident, my business, my home, my purpose. He paused, drawing a deep breath. But I was wrong about what matters. The room was absolutely silent now, hanging on his every word. What matters isn't what we own or what we've lost. It's what we give. Every day at this center, I watch broken people find their strength again. I see veterans who've lost hope learn to build something beautiful with their hands. His voice grew stronger. They teach me more than I teach them. They show me that dignity isn't in what we have, it's in what we do for others. In the back, Richard's hands trembled slightly as he wiped his eyes. Second, chances aren't just about getting back what you lost, Daniel continued. They're about finding something new to believe in, something bigger than yourself. He gestured to the photos in the display case. These men and women, they're not just building homes, they're rebuilding lives. And in helping them, I found my way back to life too. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous standing ovation. Emily couldn't hold back her tears as she watched Daniel's face, saw the quiet pride there, the healing. After the speeches, as people mingled and wrote checks for the project, Daniel found Emily by the refreshment table. Thank you, he said simply. Emily shook her head. I didn't do anything. You did this, all of it. You saw me, Daniel replied quietly. When I was invisible to everyone else, even myself, you saw me. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the crowd, watching Richard talk quietly with some veterans in the corner. You know, Emily said, when I first tried to apologize to you in the thrift store, I thought I was being generous. I had no idea how much I had to learn about real generosity. Daniel smiled. That rare, full smile that transformed his whole face. We all have something to learn from each other. That's what community means. The evening wound down, volunteers started stacking chairs, and the final donation total exceeded their wildest hopes. But more than money, something precious had been built that night: understanding, respect, and the quiet strength of friendship born from shared purpose. Emily watched Daniel helping clean up, showing the same care with folding chairs as he did with his finest woodwork. She thought about how far they'd both come from that first cruel encounter in the thrift store. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in humility, she realized, and the strongest bridges are built by hands that know what it means to fall. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly in the empty conference room as Daniel Hayes sat at the polished oak table, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully reviewed each page of the ownership transfer agreement. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds, creating stripes across the papers. His fingers traced each line methodically, the way his father had taught him to read contracts years ago. The familiar smell of coffee wafted from his cup, reminding him of countless nights spent building Hayes and Warner from nothing. 20 years felt like yesterday. Everything looking good? Richard's assistant Jenny poked her head in, holding more folders. Daniel managed a tired smile. Getting there. These things take time to do right. She nodded and placed the additional documents beside him. Mr. Warner said these might be relevant too, the original incorporation papers from when the company first started. Thank you, Jenny. Daniel reached for the yellowed folder, his heart catching at the sight of his own younger signature on the cover sheet. He and Richard had been so proud that day, two friends ready to build something lasting. As he flipped through the old incorporation documents, a section in the fine print caught his eye. Daniel adjusted his glasses, leaning closer. His chest tightened as he read the clause buried in the legal jargon. In the event of separation or dissolution of partnership, all controlling interests and voting rights remain solely with majority shareholder Richard Warner and his designated successors. Daniel's hands began to shake. The date on the clause predated his family's tragedy, back when Richard had first betrayed him. The same clause that had stripped him of his company was still legally binding. No matter what promises Richard made now, Daniel could never truly reclaim his position as owner. The coffee cup crashed to the floor as Daniel stood abruptly, paper scattering. Jenny rushed in at the sound. Mr. Hayes? Is everything all right? He couldn't speak, his throat constricting with rage and hurt. After all the speeches about redemption and second chances, Richard had known this clause existed. The whole thing had been another manipulation. Daniel grabbed his jacket, nearly running into Emily as she entered the office floor. Her smile faded when she saw his face. Daniel? What's wrong? He thrust the incorporation papers at her, his voice raw. Ask your husband about Clause 23B. Seems he forgot to mention it when he was busy playing at redemption. Emily scanned the highlighted section, her face falling. Oh no. Daniel? Wait. But he was already heading for the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The same hallway where he and Richard had once dreamed up their future, back when trust meant something. The drive to the community center passed in a blur. Daniel's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as memories flooded back, losing Sarah and Katie, discovering Richard's betrayal, watching everything he'd built crumble while he grieved. He'd been a fool to think anything had changed. The community center was quiet when he arrived, most volunteers gone for the day. Daniel headed straight for the workshop where he stored his tools. The familiar space usually brought him peace, but today, the half-finished projects just reminded him of all his broken dreams. He began gathering his tools roughly, throwing them into his old toolbox. The clang of metal on metal matched the pounding in his head. 20 years of carpentry skills, reduced to teaching basics at a thrift store, he'd thought maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild something of his old life. The door creaked open behind him. Emily stood there, still holding the damning papers. Daniel, please, let me explain. He didn't turn around, continuing to pack. Nothing to explain. The legal writing is pretty clear. Just like last time, Richard didn't remember about this clause. He never meant, Daniel spun to face her, his voice cracking. Didn't remember? It's his company, the one he stole from me. He remembers every detail. Emily stepped closer, reaching out. You've seen how he's changed, how we've all changed. This isn't like before. But Daniel couldn't hear it anymore. The toolbox slammed shut with finality. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper, heavy with defeat. I thought I'd finally mattered again. Emily's heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors of their sprawling, empty house as she stormed through the heavy oak front door, her hands trembling with barely contained fury and disbelief. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the grand foyer, painting everything in deep shades of amber and charcoal gray. The silence of the house felt oppressive, broken only by the echo of her footsteps reverberating off the vaulted ceilings. "Richard!" Her voice cracked as it echoed through the cavernous halls, bouncing off imported Italian marble and custom millwork. "Richard, where are you? We need to talk." She found him exactly where she'd expected, sequestered in his mahogany-paneled study, slumped deep in his oversized leather chair like a man who'd been deflated. A crystal tumbler of aged scotch sat untouched on his antique desk, the amber liquid catching the fading light streaming through the tall windows behind him. He looked older than she'd ever seen him, as if the weight of 2 decades had suddenly crashed down on his shoulders all at once. "Did you know?" Emily's voice cracked with a mixture of betrayal and desperation. "Did you know about that clause when you offered him partnership again? Tell me the truth, Richard." Richard slowly lifted his tired, bloodshot eyes to meet hers. The usual sharp-eyed businessman she'd married, the man who could negotiate million-dollar deals with steely confidence, was completely gone. In his place sat someone who looked utterly lost and thoroughly broken, a shell of his former self. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "I swear to you, Emily, I didn't remember. I buried it so deep, I thought it was gone forever. How could you not remember something so important?" She began pacing the length of the Persian rug, her pearl necklace catching the dying golden light with each agitated step. "That clause strips him of any real ownership rights, Richard. It makes everything we've done, every apology, every gesture, completely meaningless." Richard ran a trembling, age-spotted hand through his thinning gray hair, his wedding ring catching the lamplight. "It was 20 years ago, Emily. 20 long years." His voice grew quieter, more strained. After Sarah and little Katie died in that accident, after Daniel just disappeared from all our lives. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. "I buried everything from that terrible time so deep I could barely breathe when I thought about it. The clause was my corporate lawyer's idea back then, insurance against future complications, he called it. I was grieving too, you know. I never thought. You never thought Daniel would come back." Emily finished softly, some of her righteous anger beginning to deflate as she saw the genuine anguish in her husband's weathered face. She sank heavily into the burgundy leather chair across from his desk, suddenly feeling utterly exhausted by the weight of it all. "I believe you, Richard, but Daniel never will. Not after this." "I know," Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dear God, I know." He stared down at his weathered hands, studying the liver spots and wrinkles as if they held answers. "I've spent years repenting for what I did, Emily. Years trying to forget, trying to make peace with destroying my best friend's life. And now that I've finally had a chance." His voice trailed off as he gestured helplessly at the space between them. Emily watched her husband, this once proud, successful man she'd built a life with, crumple in on himself like delicate paper consumed by flames. The steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner marked each heavy, uncomfortable moment of silence that stretched between them like a chasm. "I can still see his face," Richard continued, his voice growing thick with unshed tears. "The day we opened our very first office downtown, he insisted on doing all the carpentry work himself, every cabinet, every shelf, every piece of trim. Said a man should build his own dreams with his own 2 hands. A bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaped him. I was so genuinely impressed by his skill, his unwavering integrity, his vision. And what did I do with that trust? I took his dream and turned it into nothing but stocks and profit margins and quarterly reports." Emily stood slowly and walked to the tall window that overlooked their manicured garden. Outside, dark storm clouds were gathering on the horizon like an approaching army, perfectly mirroring the tempest that had erupted in their carefully ordered lives. "He trusted you again, Richard," she said quietly, her breath fogging the glass. "Despite everything you'd done to him, despite losing his family, despite 20 years of struggle, he was willing to try again." "I know." Richard's voice cracked completely. "That's exactly what makes this so much worse. I finally had a real chance to make things right between us, and instead..." He gestured helplessly at the air around him, unable to find words for the magnitude of his failure. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance as the first spat drops of rain began to pelt against the windows. Emily pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the water trace intricate patterns down the pane like tears. Her own reflection stared back at her from the darkening glass, and she couldn't help but remember that awful day in the thrift store, how easily, how carelessly she'd judged a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. "I saw him today," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the increasing rain. "At the Veterans Community Center? Did you know he's been teaching those disabled veterans how to build children's furniture? Rocking chairs, toy chests, little tables and chairs?" She paused, swallowing past the lump in her throat. "They donate every single piece to local shelters and foster homes. Even after everything life has thrown at him, everything he's lost, he's still trying to build beautiful things for others." Richard picked up his untouched scotch with a visibly shaking hand, stared at it for a long moment, then set it back down without taking a sip. "He was always the better man," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I knew it back then, and I know it even more clearly now." He looked up at his wife with eyes that glistened with unshed tears. "How do you fix 20 years of wrong, Emily? How do you possibly make up for destroying someone's entire life?" The rain was falling steadily now, drumming against the windows in a hypnotic rhythm that filled the silence. Emily watched the streams of water blur the world outside into soft impressionist strokes of gray and deep green. In that quiet moment, something crystallized in her mind with startling clarity, a truth as pure and clear as the first raindrop on glass. She turned from the window to face her broken husband, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Then maybe you don't try to undo it," she whispered. "Maybe you just atone." The autumn chill crept through Willow Creek as leaves scattered across empty sidewalks. At the community center, Daniel worked alone, his methodical sanding creating a quiet rhythm that filled the workshop. 3 unanswered messages blinked on his phone, 2 from Emily, 1 from Richard. He hadn't bothered reading them. The wooden table beneath his hands was taking shape, destined for a veteran's new apartment. Daniel focused on each stroke, letting the familiar motion dull his thoughts. Sawdust coated his worn jacket like a second skin. "Dad?" Noah stood in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. "It's almost 7. Are we having dinner?" Daniel looked up, blinking as if waking from a dream. "Sorry, son." Lost track of time. He brushed sawdust from his hands but made no move to pack up his tools. "There's some leftover chili in the fridge." Noah shifted his weight, uncertainty clear in his young face. "You said that yesterday. And the day before. I'll be home soon." Daniel promised, already turning back to his work. "Just need to finish this section." "That's what you said last night too." Noah's voice carried a hint of frustration. "You barely said 10 words at breakfast. Or the morning before that." Daniel's hands stilled on the wood. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words. Finally, he said softly, "I know. I'm sorry, Noah. I just need some time." "Time for what? To disappear again?" Noah's voice cracked. "Like after Mom and Katie?" The mention of his late wife and daughter made Daniel flinch. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "That's not fair, son. Neither is shutting me out." Noah dropped his backpack with a thud. "I'm not a little kid anymore, Dad. I can handle the truth." Before Daniel could respond, a gentle knock interrupted them. Emily stood in the workshop entrance, holding a covered casserole dish. Her elegant clothes looked out of place among the tools and sawdust. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said softly. "I brought dinner. My mother's recipe for chicken pot pie." Daniel's expression remained carefully neutral. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." Emily stepped inside, setting the dish on a clean workbench. "Noah mentioned you've been working late. I thought you both could use a home-cooked meal." Noah's face brightened slightly. "Thanks, Mrs. Warner. It smells." "Amazing." Emily smiled at him, then turned to Daniel. "The Veterans Housing Project needs your expertise, Daniel. The contractor they hired can't match your quality of work." "I'm sure they'll manage," Daniel replied flatly, picking up his sandpaper again. Emily watched him work for a moment, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Richard didn't know about the clause. He's been sick with guilt. "Mrs. Warner," Daniel interrupted quietly, still focused on his sanding. "I appreciate the dinner and your kindness to Noah, but I can't do this right now." Noah looked between them, worry etched on his young face. "Dad, maybe we could." "Noah," Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "Please take the casserole home and get started on your homework. I'll be there soon." The teenager hesitated, then grabbed his backpack and the dish. Thanks again, Mrs. Warner, he mumbled before heading out. Emily lingered, watching Daniel work with single-minded focus. You're punishing yourself more than anyone else, she said softly. Is that what you think this is? Daniel's hands never stopped moving across the wood. I'm just doing what I've always done, surviving, taking care of my son, building things that matter, and shutting out everyone who cares about you? Daniel finally looked up, his eyes tired but resolute. Mrs. Warner, I've learned that caring comes with conditions. Trust comes with fine print. I can't afford either anymore. Emily stepped closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. That's not true, and you know it. Noah needs his father, not just his physical presence, but his heart too. My heart is what got us into this mess. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. I trusted too easily, believed in second chances. And you were right to, Emily insisted. One hidden clause doesn't erase the good you've done, the lives you've touched here. Daniel set down his sandpaper, suddenly looking exhausted. Thank you for dinner and for looking out for Noah. But please, I need space. Emily recognized the quiet finality in his tone. She nodded slowly, gathering her purse. At the door, she paused, turning back one last time. Daniel had moved to his workbench, kneeling beside it in what she first thought was inspection of the wood. But his head was bowed, hands clasped, shoulders shaking slightly with silent tears that fell onto the scarred surface of his bench. Emily watched for a moment as this proud, broken man poured out his pain in wordless prayer, then quietly slipped away into the gathering dusk. Richard Warner stood at the head of the conference table, his fingers trembling slightly as he shuffled through financial reports. The boardroom's harsh, fluorescent lights cast deep shadows under his eyes, highlighting weeks of sleepless nights. 20 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting. As you can see from the third quarter projections, his voice faltered. The papers slipped from his grasp, scattering across the polished mahogany. Richard reached for them, but the movement seemed to drain what little color remained in his face. Mr. Warner? Janet, his secretary, took a step forward. Are you all right? Richard's hand clutched at his chest. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. I can't. The words died in his throat as he stumbled backward, knocking over his chair with a crash that echoed through the suddenly silent room. Call 911, someone shouted. Janet was already on her phone, her voice tight with panic as she gave the dispatcher their location. Richard slumped against the wall, his eyes wide with fear. Within minutes, the quiet corporate hallways erupted with the sound of rushing footsteps and urgent voices. Paramedics burst through the door with their equipment, quickly assessing Richard's condition. Their faces grew grave as they worked. Possible cardiac event, one said into his radio. Patient showing signs of acute distress. Emily arrived just as they were, loading Richard into the ambulance. Her designer heels clattered across the parking lot as she ran, her face pale with worry. "Richard!" she called out, catching his hand before they closed the doors. His skin felt cold and clammy against hers. "Ma'am, you can follow us to Memorial," a paramedic said gently, helping her step back. The ambulance's sirens wailed to life, and Emily watched it disappear around the corner, her heart pounding. At the hospital, the waiting room felt like a prison cell. Emily paced back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear. "Please, Daniel," she whispered, leaving her third voicemail. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Richard, he's had a heart attack. It's bad. Please come." Hours crawled by. Doctors came and went, their faces serious as they explained terms like myocardial infarction and severe blockage. Emily barely heard them through her fog of worry. She tried Daniel's number again. This time, he answered. "Emily?" His voice was flat, guarded. "Daniel, please," she said, fighting back tears. "The doctors say. They say he might not." She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm sorry about Richard," Daniel replied quietly, "but I can't be there." "Not after everything, Daniel. Goodbye, Emily." The line went dead. Emily sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Back at their modest apartment, Daniel set his phone down on the kitchen counter. His hands were steady, but his jaw was clenched tight. Noah stood in the doorway, watching his father with concerned eyes. "That was Mrs. Warner, wasn't it?" Noah asked softly. Daniel nodded, not turning around. "Mr. Warner's in the hospital. Heart attack." Are we going? No. Daniel started washing dishes that didn't need washing, the water running too hot over his hands. We're not. Noah stepped closer. Dad, Noah, please, don't. Remember what you told me? Noah's voice grew stronger. About what makes a man. It wasn't about success or money. It was about doing what's right, even when it hurts. Daniel's shoulders tensed. The dish in his hands clattered into the sink. You also said forgiveness isn't about the other person, Noah continued. It's about not letting bitterness poison your own heart. Daniel turned slowly, meeting his son's steady gaze. In that moment, he saw Sarah in Noah's eyes, her wisdom, her gentle strength. Dad, Noah said softly, forgiveness isn't weakness. The words hung in the air between them. Daniel looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not just the boy he'd raised, but the man he was becoming. A better man, perhaps, than he himself had been. Finally, Daniel's rigid posture softened. He dried his hands on a dish towel, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You're right, son, he said quietly. Let's go. The hospital corridor buzzed with the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and beeping monitors. Daniel Hayes stood outside room 412, his weathered hands clasped together, wrestling with decades of hurt and the sudden weight of mortality. Noah placed a gentle hand on his father's shoulder. You taught me forgiveness isn't weakness, Dad, Noah whispered. Maybe it's time to believe it yourself. Through the window, they could see Emily sitting beside Richard's bed, her fingers intertwined with her husband's. The machines tracking his heartbeat created a steady, if somewhat weak, rhythm. Daniel drew a deep breath and pushed open the door. The antiseptic smell hit him first, then the soft whir of oxygen flowing through tubes. Richard's eyes fluttered open at the sound of footsteps. Daniel. Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. You came. Emily stood, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I'll give you both some privacy. She squeezed Richard's hand one last time and stepped out, Noah following quietly behind her. Daniel moved closer to the bed, taking in the sight of his former partner. Richard's usually commanding presence had diminished, his hospital gown making him look smaller, more vulnerable. The monitors cast a bluish glow across his pale face. Sit. Richard gestured weakly to the chair Emily had vacated. Please. Daniel lowered himself into the chair, its vinyl cushion creaking softly. For a moment, neither man spoke. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence. I've been trying to make things right, Richard finally said, his voice trembling. But I keep failing. Even when I think I'm doing good, the past catches up. Richard, Daniel started, but Richard raised a shaking hand. Let me finish, please. He took a labored breath. You know what I realized, lying here? You built the foundation. I just painted it gold. A bitter smile crossed his face. And gold paint. It chips away eventually. Shows what's underneath. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. We both made that company what it was. No. Richard's voice grew stronger for a moment. You made it what it was meant to be. A place where people mattered more than profit. Where integrity wasn't just a word in a mission statement. He coughed, and Daniel automatically reached for the water glass on the bedside table. After taking a small sip through the straw, Richard continued. I have something for you. He motioned toward a leather portfolio on the table. Emily, she helped me prepare it yesterday. Would you? Daniel retrieved the portfolio and opened it. Inside were legal documents, property deeds, and bank statements. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. My personal assets, Richard explained. All of them, separate from the company. I'm signing them over to you and Noah. He managed a weak smile. This won't fix the past, but maybe it'll build someone's future. Richard, I can't. You can. And you will. Richard's voice carried a hint of his old authority. Not for me, for those veterans you help, for kids like Noah, who deserve a chance at college, for all the foundations we should have built together. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he looked at the man who had once been both friend and betrayer. I forgive you, he said softly. I think I forgave you a long time ago. I just couldn't admit it. Richard's eyes glistened. You're a better man than I ever was, Daniel Hayes. He reached out with a trembling hand, and Daniel took it without hesitation. Promise me something? What's that? Don't let the gold paint fool you anymore. Build things that last. Daniel squeezed his hand gently. I promise. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the tension of years melting away. Emily peeked in occasionally but didn't interrupt. The sunset painted the room in warm oranges and pinks, a stark contrast to the clinical white walls. Richard's breathing grew more labored as evening approached. "Would you pray with me?" he asked suddenly. "Like we used to, before board meetings?" Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He bowed his head, still holding Richard's hand. "Dear Lord," he began, his voice steady despite the tears. "Thank you for second chances, for foundations that can be rebuilt, for hearts that can be healed." As he prayed, he felt Richard's grip gradually loosen. The monitor's beeping slowed, then flatlined into a single, sustained tone. Emily rushed in, a sob catching in her throat as she saw her husband's peaceful expression. Daniel kept hold of Richard's hand, watching as the last rays of sunset painted the room in gentle gold. Morning dew clung to the grass at Willow Creek Cemetery, catching the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. The autumn air held a crisp bite, and fallen leaves danced across the manicured grounds. Dark-clad figures moved silently between the headstones, gathering around a polished mahogany casket draped with white roses. Daniel Hayes stood at the back of the crowd, his hands tucked into the pockets of a simple black suit. Emily had insisted on buying him. Noah stood beside him, tall and solemn in his debate team blazer. They watched as people filled the rows of white chairs, their whispered conversations creating a soft murmur beneath the rustling trees. Emily Warner sat in the front row, her black dress and pearl necklace a stark contrast to her pale face. Her fingers worried at a handkerchief, twisting it into knots. When she turned and caught sight of Daniel, relief flooded her features. She motioned for them to join her. As they made their way forward, Daniel noticed familiar faces from the company. Secretaries who'd known him 20 years ago, foremen who'd worked under his supervision, even the old janitor who used to share coffee with him during late nights at the office. They nodded respectfully as he passed. The minister stepped forward, his voice carrying across the gathering. "We are here today to celebrate the life of Richard Warner, a man who understood that life's greatest achievements often come through its hardest lessons." Daniel listened as various speakers shared memories, business associates praising Richard's acumen, charity board members noting his generosity, friends recalling his wit. But it was the small details that caught in Daniel's throat. The way Richard always remembered employees' children's names, how he'd quietly paid for college funds, his habit of leaving anonymous donations at the community center. When it came time for the eulogy, Emily squeezed Daniel's hand. He rose slowly, straightening his tie as he approached the podium. The morning sun warmed his face as he looked out over the gathered mourners. "I knew two Richard Warners," he began, his voice steady and clear. "The first was a young man full of dreams, who stood beside me as we hammered the first nail into our company's future. We were more than business partners. We were brothers in all but blood, sharing sandwiches on lunch breaks and hope in equal measure." He paused, letting his gaze drift over the familiar faces. The second Richard Warner was shaped by choices that haunted him. "For years, I only saw that version, the one whose decisions cost me everything I thought mattered." Emily dabbed at her eyes with the crumpled handkerchief. Noah wrapped an arm around her shoulders, offering silent support. "But there was a third Richard Warner," Daniel continued, "one I met only recently. A man who understood that success isn't measured in dollar signs or stock prices, but in the lives we touch and the bridges we rebuild." His voice grew softer. "That Richard Warner taught me something profound about grace, not just in receiving it, but in giving it." The wind rustled through the trees, sending more leaves spinning through the air. You see, grace isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to see beyond the paint and polish to the foundation underneath. Richard spent his final years trying to strip away the gold leaf of success to reveal something more valuable: authenticity, humility, and the courage to face one's own failures. Daniel gripped the edges of the podium, his next words coming from somewhere deep within. "He taught me that forgiveness isn't a single moment, but a daily choice. That redemption sometimes comes wrapped in unexpected packages, and that it's never too late to start building something true." In the front row, several of Richard's old employees nodded, wiping away tears. Emily's shoulders shook with silent sobs as Noah held her closer. "Yesterday, in his final moments, Richard asked me to pray with him, just like we used to 20 years ago, before every major decision." Daniel's voice wavered slightly. "In that hospital room, I realized something. The man I'd spent years resenting had died long ago. The one who left us yesterday was different. He was someone who understood that true wealth isn't in what we build, but in what we rebuild." Looking at the casket, Daniel softened his tone. "Richard Warner, Learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it well. He leaves behind not just a legacy of business success, but something far more valuable, a testament to the power of second chances and the possibility of change. As Daniel stepped down from the podium, the minister began the final prayers. The morning sun had risen higher, burning away the last of the dew. Emily reached for Daniel's hand as he returned to his seat, her grip tight with gratitude. After the service, as the crowd began to disperse, they stood together watching the casket being lowered into the ground. The thud of earth on wood created a steady rhythm as mourners took turns with the shovel, participating in this final act of farewell. Noah kept his arm around Emily, his young face showing a maturity beyond his years. She leaned into his support, drawing comfort from this unexpected family she'd found. When most of the mourners had gone, leaving only the three of them standing by the fresh grave, Daniel broke the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for Emily and Noah to hear. "The man I hated died long ago," he said softly. "This one just needed forgiveness." Emily's tears fell fresh, but her smile held peace. Noah squeezed her shoulders gently, understanding passing between them all like a current of grace. Autumn leaves swirled outside the window of Emily's home office as she and Daniel sat surrounded by stacks of paperwork. The morning light filtered through gauzy curtains, casting a warm glow on the scattered documents and coffee cups between them. Emily's reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied another form. "I think we've got all the legal requirements covered," she said, shuffling through the incorporation papers. "The foundation can start accepting donations next week." Daniel nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that read, "World's Best Dad, a recent gift from Noah." "Still feels strange, having his name next to mine." Again. "The Warner Hayes Foundation?" Emily tested the words. "It sounds right, doesn't it? Like something meant to be." "Sarah would have loved this," Daniel said softly, touching the silver wedding band he still wore. "She always said true healing comes from helping others heal." Noah burst into the room, his laptop tucked under his arm, dark hair tousled from running. "I've finished it," he announced, setting the computer down between them. "The logo design, what do you think?" On the screen, a simple yet elegant design appeared, two hands clasped together, forming the shape of a house. Below, in clean typography, the Warner Hayes Foundation, building second chances. Emily's eyes welled up. "Oh, Noah, it's perfect." Daniel squeezed his son's shoulder. "You've got your mother's eye for beauty, that's for sure." "I wanted it to show what we're really about," Noah explained, his voice earnest. "Not just building houses, but building hope. Like what happened with us." The phone rang, and Emily answered it. Her face brightened as she listened. "That's wonderful news." "Yes, we'll be there tomorrow morning." She hung up and turned to them. "The zoning board approved our request. We can start renovating the old warehouse next week." "First project of the foundation," Daniel mused. "From empty building to veteran housing and training center. Just like the one that helped us," Noah added. Throughout the next few weeks, word spread through Willow Creek about the foundation. Emily's social connections, once focused on charity galas and fashion shows, now buzzed with genuine excitement about making real change. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. From rivalry to redemption, local business leaders' legacy of second chances. The article detailed Richard's final act of generosity and Daniel's journey from loss to forgiveness. Applications from veterans and single parents began pouring in. At the community center, Daniel and Noah worked side by side, teaching basic carpentry to the first group of veterans. Emily managed the administrative side, her organizational skills proving invaluable. The same determination that once drove her social climbing now powered something meaningful. "Mr. Hayes?" A veteran named Mike approached Daniel one afternoon, holding up a perfectly joined piece of woodwork. "Never thought I'd be able to do something like this with my hands shaking so bad. But you were right, the wood, it kind of steadies you." Daniel smiled, remembering his own healing journey through working with his hands. "Wood's honest that way. Doesn't care about your past, just how you treat it in the present." The warehouse renovation progressed quickly, with volunteer crews working alongside the veterans in training. Local businesses donated materials, and former employees from Hayes and Warner Builders offered their expertise. The community's response overwhelmed Emily. "I used to think I knew everyone who mattered in this town," she confessed to Daniel one evening as they watched volunteers painting walls. "Now I realize I was looking in all the wrong places." Noah spent his after-school hours helping wherever needed, proud to see his father's quiet strength touching so many lives. He'd overheard someone call Daniel a silent hero and couldn't think of a better description. The day they hung the sign on the renovated community center, a small crowd gathered. Daniel stepped back, taking in the fresh paint and new windows, remembering the broken-down building it had been just months ago. Emily stood beside him, her designer clothes long since traded for practical workwear. "Richard would be proud," she said softly. "This is what redemption looks like." "This is what grace looks like," Daniel corrected gently. Noah emerged from inside, carrying a wooden plaque he'd crafted himself. The words were carved deep and clear. "Grace is never out of stock." Daniel's eyes misted as he helped his son hang it above the entrance. The morning sun caught the polished wood, making it glow like a promise kept. The three of them stood together, watching as people filed in for the day's training sessions. Veterans with new purpose in their steps, single parents finding hope in fresh starts, volunteers carrying coffee and donuts, sharing stories and smiles. "Ready for another day?" Emily asked, her voice warm with friendship and shared purpose. Daniel nodded, touching the plaque one last time before heading inside. "Grace is never out of stock," he repeated softly. "And neither is hope." The morning sun streamed through the community center's tall windows, casting long golden rectangles across the worn wooden floors. Dust motes danced in the warm light like tiny stars, and the air carried the familiar scent of old books and fresh coffee from the volunteer kitchen. Noah sat at one of the donated tables, his hands trembling as he stared at the thick envelope from Stanford University. The cream-colored paper felt substantial in his grip, heavier than any letter should be, as if it carried the weight of all his dreams and fears bundled together. Daniel stood beside him, one weathered hand resting supportively on his son's shoulder. His own heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice remained steady and calm. "Whatever it says, son, I'm proud of you. You've already accomplished more than I ever dreamed possible." Around them, the usual morning bustle of the community center had quieted. Several volunteers pretended to sort through donation boxes, but their attention was clearly focused on the young man holding his future in an envelope. The old air conditioning unit hummed in the corner, and somewhere in the back room, someone was quietly stacking chairs. Noah took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs completely and makes time slow down. His fingers found the edge of the envelope and tore it open with careful precision. The sound of ripping paper seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed space. His eyes scanned the first line once, then twice, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes grew wide, and the letter began to shake in his hands like a leaf in the wind. "Dad." His voice cracked on the single word, breaking like it had when he was 12 years old. "I got in, full scholarship. They want me." The transformation on Daniel's face was immediate and complete. Years of worry lines smoothed the way as joy flooded his features, erasing the shadows that had lived there for so long. His eyes filled with tears that caught the morning light, and he pulled Noah into a fierce embrace that spoke of all the nights he'd worried, all the prayers he'd whispered, all the hope he'd carried in silence. "My boy," he whispered against Noah's hair, his voice thick with emotion. "My brilliant, wonderful boy." Emily, who had been pretending to organize a box of children's books near the windows, dropped everything and rushed over. Her own eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she clapped her hands together like a delighted child. "Did I hear that right? Stanford? Oh, Noah! Oh my goodness!" Noah nodded, still looking dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe the words on the page were real. "They want me for their pre-law program. The letter says, my debate team achievements and community service hours were exceptional. They mentioned the work I've done here at the center specifically." Daniel stepped back to look at his son, his hand still gripping Noah's shoulders. "You've got a future brighter than anything I could have built with all the money in the world," he said, his voice thick with pride and wonder. He squeezed Noah's shoulder gently. "Your mother would be so proud. She always said you had her brain and my stubborn streak. Turns out that's a pretty good combination." Word spread through the center like wildfire. Tom, the grizzled veteran who Daniel had taught to build birdhouses as therapy for his PTSD, abandoned his morning coffee and fired up the ancient propane grill behind the building. The old thing wheezed and sputtered before catching with a satisfying whoosh. Sarah, one of the regular volunteers who had become like a grandmother to Noah, started pulling out paper plates and plastic cups from the supply closet, her movements quick and purposeful. Within minutes, someone had hung a hastily made banner across the main room that read, "Congratulations, Noah," in wobbly red letters on a white bedsheet. The words were crooked and the marker had bled through in places, but it was perfect in its imperfection, made with love and genuine excitement. The impromptu celebration grew organically as more people arrived for their usual Friday morning activities. Veterans Daniel had taught woodworking skills, single mothers from the parenting support group, elderly folks from the weekly lunch program, and volunteers from all corners of their little community gathered to share in the joy. The smell of grilling hamburgers and hot dogs began to fill the air, mixing with the sounds of laughter and congratulations that echoed off the center's high ceilings. Emily found herself wiping away tears as she watched Daniel move through the growing crowd. His face absolutely glowed with pride as person after person stopped to congratulate him about Noah's achievement. She could see how each handshake, each pat on the back, each genuine expression of joy seemed to make him stand a little taller. He looked younger somehow, lighter, as if a hidden weight that had pressed down on his shoulders for years had finally lifted and floated away. "That boy of yours is going places," called out Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who ran the center's food pantry, always knew he was special, the way he helped translate for the new families. "Stanford," marveled Jim, another veteran who'd become one of Daniel's closest friends. "Never had anyone from our little town make it to Stanford before." "You raised him right, Daniel." Noah sat at one of the mismatched picnic tables. They dragged in from the back room, completely surrounded by well-wishers. His acceptance letter was safely tucked in his shirt pocket, close to his heart, but he couldn't stop touching it through the fabric to make sure it was real. His smile was so wide it looked like it might split his face in two, and he tried his best to answer everyone's eager questions about his plans for college, his major, his dreams for the future. "You know," Emily said, finding a quiet moment to sit down next to Daniel at the edge of the celebration, "this is exactly what the foundation is meant to do, help dreams come true. This is why we do all of this work." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving his son's animated face as Noah gestured excitedly while telling someone about his planned course of study. "When Sarah and Amy died, I thought all our dreams died with them. I couldn't see past the next day, let alone imagine something like this." He gestured toward Noah, his voice soft with wonder. "But look at him now. He never let the darkness win. He never stopped believing that good things could happen." The afternoon sun gradually gave way to the golden hour of early evening, and someone suddenly remembered that it was the night of the town's annual summer festival. Through the open windows, they could hear the distant pop and whistle of fireworks starting at the municipal park just a few blocks away. The sound carried on the warm breeze, along with the faint strains of carnival music and the happy chatter of families enjoying the festivities. Without any formal decision being made, the celebration naturally moved to the center's front lawn. People grabbed their folding chairs and spread blankets on the grass under the old oak trees that Daniel and his work crews had carefully preserved when they renovated the building. The sky was beginning to deepen from blue to purple, and the first stars were starting to appear like tiny pinpricks of light. Then the real fireworks began. The sky exploded with color, brilliant reds that bloomed like giant flowers, electric blues that cascaded like waterfalls, and vibrant greens that spiraled upward before bursting into 1,000 smaller lights. Each explosion was followed by appreciative oohs and ahs from the gathered crowd, and children pointed excitedly at their favorites. Noah sat cross-legged on a worn quilt between Daniel and Emily, his acceptance letter still in his pocket like a talisman, his future stretching out before him like the endless sky above. The possibilities seemed as infinite as the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. Daniel watched the colorful reflections dance in his son's eyes and saw in them the same determination and unshakable hope that Sarah had always carried, even in her darkest moments. "This," Daniel whispered, as another massive burst of gold and silver illuminated all their upturned faces. "This is what rebuilding really means. Not just fixing buildings or starting businesses, but building something that lasts, building hope." The fireworks continued their spectacular display, each burst seeming to celebrate not just Noah's incredible achievement, but every small victory that had led them to this moment. Every piece of broken furniture lovingly repaired, every veteran patiently taught a new skill, every act of forgiveness given and received, every day they'd chosen hope over despair. In those magical moments of shared joy, under the sparkling summer sky, they weren't just watching a fireworks show. They were witnessing the beautiful culmination of a journey that had brought them all together, bound by something far stronger than blood. the transformative power of second chances, and the miracle of love that multiplies when it's shared. The warm air smelled of barbecue smoke and summer grass, with just a hint of the honeysuckle that grew wild along the center's back fence. Somewhere in the crowd, old Tom started singing Amazing Grace in his gravelly voice, and other voices gradually joined in, creating a gentle harmony that rose softly into the star-filled night. Daniel closed his eyes and let the moment wash over him completely. The achingly beautiful music, the continuing pops and whistles of the fireworks, the solid warmth of his son beside him, and the deep, soul-settling knowledge that sometimes the strongest foundations aren't built of concrete and steel, but of faith, forgiveness, and the kind of love that refuses to give up, no matter how dark the night becomes. The December wind whistled through the community center's windows, but inside, warmth and the sweet smell of fresh sawdust filled the air. Daniel Hayes stood at his workbench, carefully sanding the edges of a wooden train engine. Around him, the room buzzed with activity. Veterans and teenagers working side by side at their stations, each focused on crafting Christmas toys. "Mr. Hayes, could you check this?" called Tommy, a young veteran with a prosthetic leg. He held up a half-finished rocking horse, its curves still rough but promising. Daniel smiled, setting down his own project. The title Mr. Hayes still felt strange sometimes, but he'd grown used to it over the past months. His carpentry classes had become so popular, they'd had to start a waiting list. "Looking good, Tommy," he said, running his hand along the horse's neck. "Just remember what I taught you about following the grain when you sand, like this." He demonstrated with smooth, sure strokes. At the next table, 16-year-old Maria carefully painted delicate flowers on a dollhouse. She'd been one of his first students, originally sent by her probation officer. Now she was one of his best helpers. Emily Warner entered carrying boxes of wrapping paper and ribbons, her cheeks pink from the cold. "The elves have arrived," she announced, setting down her supplies. She'd traded her designer clothes for jeans and a comfortable sweater, looking more at home here than she ever had at country club gatherings. "Perfect timing," Daniel said. "We've got quite a collection ready for wrapping." Along the back wall, finished toys waited in neat rows, wooden cars with spinning wheels, trains with connecting cars, dollhouses with tiny furniture, rocking horses ready for paint, and building blocks smooth as silk. Each piece had been crafted with careful attention to detail and safety. "I can't believe how many we've made," Emily marveled, running her fingers over a particularly beautiful dollhouse. "Remember when you could barely fill one shelf?" Daniel nodded, thinking back to those early days. "Things change. People change," Emily added softly, meeting his eyes with understanding. They'd developed an easy friendship over the months since Richard's passing. Emily had thrown herself into the foundation work, transforming grief into purpose. She'd become as much a fixture at the center as Daniel himself. "Jake, careful with that saw," Daniel called out, noticing one of his younger students getting careless. He walked over to correct the boy's technique, demonstrating the proper grip. "Remember, respect the tool and it'll respect you back." The afternoon wore on as they worked. Emily set up a wrapping station, teaching some of the teens how to make perfect corners and fancy bows. Christmas music played softly from an old radio, mixing with the sounds of sanding and hammering. "Mr. Hayes," called out George, a veteran in his 60s, "tell us again about your first carpentry project." Daniel chuckled. "You've heard that story a dozen times. The new folks haven't," George insisted, gesturing to some recent additions to the class. Daniel wiped his hands on his apron. "Well, I was about 12, trying to build a birdhouse for my mother. Didn't know the first thing about measuring or cutting straight. That poor birdhouse looked like it had been through a tornado before I even finished it." The class laughed, and Daniel continued working. As he spoke, "But my dad, he didn't criticize, just showed me how to learn from my mistakes. Said every crooked cut teaches you something about making the next one straight." Emily watched him as she wrapped a toy car, remembering how she'd once judged this man based on his worn clothes and quiet manner. Now she saw the wisdom in his weathered hands, the strength in his gentle teaching. A small commotion at the door drew their attention. A young mother stood there with her little boy, who was bundled up against the cold. Daniel recognized them from the shelter, where he sometimes volunteered. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the mother said, "but Tommy here couldn't wait to see the toys. He's been talking about them all week." The little boy, no more than 5, stared wide-eyed at all the wooden creations. His mittened hands were clasped together in excitement. Daniel picked up the train engine he'd just finished, his best work yet, with careful details and smooth rolling wheels. He walked over and knelt down to the boy's level. "What do you think of this?" he asked, holding out the train. Tommy's eyes grew even wider. "Is it real?" "As real as anything," Daniel said, showing him how the wheels turned. "Want to try it?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Daniel placed the train in his small hands. Tommy's face lit up with pure joy as he rolled it back and forth on the floor. Emily came to stand beside Daniel, watching the scene with misty eyes. "Every scar builds something stronger," she quoted softly, words she'd heard him say before. Daniel nodded, watching Tommy play with the train. The boy's delight made every splinter, every late night, every moment of teaching worth it. He thought of his own son, now thriving in college, and all the twists and turns that had led them here. Around them, the workshop hummed with purpose. Veterans teaching teens, teens helping younger children, all of them building something more than just toys. They were building hope, one piece at a time. "Mr. Hayes," Tommy called out, his face glowing. "Can you show me how to make one?" Daniel exchanged a warm glance with Emily before turning back to the boy. He picked up a small wooden car from his workbench, its edges still rough with possibility. "Every scar builds something stronger," he said, placing it gently in Tommy's waiting hands. The grand ballroom of the Willow Creek Hotel sparkled with elegant decorations. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables dressed in cream-colored linens and centerpieces of fresh winter roses. A banner hung above the stage reading Warner Hayes Foundation First Annual Gala, Building Second Chances. Daniel Hayes adjusted his tie, a simple blue one that Noah had picked out for him. He wore a new charcoal suit, properly tailored this time, though the sight of himself in the mirror still felt strange. A year had transformed so much, yet some memories remained vivid. That rainy afternoon in the thrift store, the broken chair he'd been fixing when Emily first apologized, Richard's final peaceful smile. Emily Warner, elegant in a navy evening gown, moved through the crowd greeting donors and community leaders. She'd organized every detail of the evening, determined to make it perfect. Her pearl necklace caught the light as she laughed with some of the veterans who'd learned carpentry in Daniel's workshop. "Ready, Dad?" Noah appeared at Daniel's side, looking grown up in his own suit. College had matured him, given him an easy confidence that made Daniel's heart swell with pride. His son had just finished his first semester with straight A's, proving that hard work and faith could indeed build bridges across any gap. "Almost," Daniel said, patting his jacket pocket to make sure his speech cards were there. "You know I'm not good at this formal stuff. You build houses, Dad. Think of it like that, one word at a time, just like one nail at a time." Noah squeezed his father's shoulder. The crowd settled into their bladder seats as Emily approached the podium. Her voice carried clearly through the ballroom. "Welcome, everyone. A year ago, this foundation was just a dream, born from pain and forgiveness. Today, we've helped 12 veteran families find homes, supported 15 single parents through job training, and watched countless lives transformed through the power of second chances." She paused, composed herself. "But before we celebrate these achievements, I'd like to introduce someone very special. He's currently studying pre-law at Vanderbilt University, and he has a few words about our foundation's co-founder. Please welcome Noah Hayes." Noah strode to the stage with purpose, his young face serious but proud. "Good evening. When I was younger, I used to think success meant having the biggest house or the most expensive clothes. My father taught me differently. He showed me that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in what you give." He looked directly at Daniel. "My father is the most generous man I know. Not because he has much to give, we've known plenty of lean times, but because he gives everything he has. When others mocked him, he responded with dignity. When betrayed, he chose forgiveness. When broken, he rebuilt himself by helping others rebuild their lives." Daniel felt tears threatening. He blinked them back, remembering all the nights he'd prayed for strength to keep going, to show Noah a better way than bitterness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Noah continued, his voice strong and clear, "please welcome my father, Daniel Hayes." The applause was warm as Daniel made his way to the podium. He hugged his son, then faced the crowd. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his cards, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "Thank you all for being here tonight. A wise man once told me that you build the foundation first, then the walls." He paused, remembering Richard's last words. "My old friend Richard Warner understood that in the end. He taught me that sometimes Our greatest mistakes can lead to our greatest redemption if we're brave enough to face them. Emily dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Daniel continued. This foundation exists because two people had the courage to change. Emily Warner could have walked away after that day in the thrift store. Instead, she chose to look deeper, to see beyond appearances. Richard could have taken his guilt to his grave. Instead, he chose to make amends, to turn wrongs into right. Daniel's voice grew stronger. Every day at our community center, I watch people rebuild their lives. Veterans learning new skills, single parents finding hope, young people discovering their worth. And you know what amazes me most? It's not the physical transformations, though those are wonderful. It's the moment when someone realizes they matter, that their story isn't over, that grace is still possible. He looked at Emily, then at Noah. A year ago, I was a bitter man, hiding behind pride and pain. Today, I stand here surrounded by family, not by blood, but by choice, by faith, by forgiveness. The audience rose to their feet, applause thundering through the ballroom. Noah rushed forward to embrace his father. Emily stood at her table, tears flowing freely now, but her smile radiant with joy and pride. As the applause continued, Daniel caught Emily's eye across the room. She nodded, understanding passing between them. They had all been strangers once, proud, hurt, lost in their own ways. Now they were family, bound together by something stronger than success or status. The courage to believe in second chances. The standing ovation continued, filling the ballroom with the sound of hope renewed and grace revealed. Through the windows, snow had begun to fall softly over Willow Creek, each flake a tiny new beginning. Sunlight glinted off fresh snow as Daniel Hayes pulled into the parking lot of what was once simply Willow Creek Thrift. The newly painted sign above the entrance now read, "The Second, Chance Store," in warm burgundy letters. He sat in his truck for a moment, fingers tracing the worn steering wheel, remembering that rainy Thursday afternoon that had changed everything. The same bell chimed above the door as he walked in, but the interior was transformed. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new lighting illuminated every corner, and the shelves were neatly organized with carefully curated donations. Yet Daniel had insisted on keeping some things the same. The old wooden counter where he'd first stood in humiliation, now polished to a soft glow, and the creaky floorboard by the dressing rooms that sang with every step. "Morning, mister?" "Hayes," called Sarah, the teenage volunteer at the register. She was one of Noah's former classmates, now earning community service hours for college applications. "Morning, Sarah," Daniel replied, adjusting his worn jacket, the same one he'd worn that first day. He'd been offered newer ones countless times, but this one reminded him of where he'd started. Its patches and worn edges told a story of survival. In the back room, 4 veterans were already waiting by the workbenches. There was Mike, who'd lost his leg in Afghanistan, Tommy, still battling PTSD, but finding peace in working with his hands, Robert, who'd been homeless until the foundation helped him find housing, and James, the youngest, learning carpentry to start his own business. Ready to build some Christmas joy, gentlemen? Daniel set down his toolbox and pulled out detailed sketches of miniature Victorian-style dollhouses. Each one would be unique, painted in different colors, with tiny wooden furniture they'd craft by hand. "These are gorgeous, Daniel," Tommy said, running his finger along the blueprints. "But ain't they a bit complicated for beginners?" Daniel smiled, pulling out pre-cut pieces of pine. "That's why we work together. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from many hands working as one." They were deep in concentration, the quiet, broken only by the sound of sandpaper and careful measuring. When the door opened, the scent of chocolate and cinnamon drifted in before Emily appeared, carrying a large thermos and a stack of paper cups. "I thought you boys might need some fuel," she announced, setting down her offerings. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by practical jeans and a comfortable sweater, but her pearls remained. A reminder that change didn't mean losing yourself entirely. "Emily, you're an angel," Mike declared, reaching eagerly for the cocoa. She poured cups for everyone, then leaned against Daniel's workbench, watching him guide James through the delicate process of crafting tiny window frames. "Remember when I thought this place wasn't good enough for proper shopping?" she mused quietly. Daniel's eyes crinkled with amusement. "God does have a sense of humor, doesn't he?" "And impeccable timing," Emily added, gesturing to the bustling store beyond the workshop doors. Young mothers browsed racks of carefully organized clothing. A grandfather helped his grandson try on a suit for his first job interview. Two veterans from Daniel's previous classes were volunteering, helping customers, and sharing their own stories of transformation. You know what Noah said when he called last night? Daniel set down his tools, wiping sawdust from his hands. He said his economics professor used our foundation as a case study in sustainable community development. My boy, teaching his college class about second chances. Emily touched his arm gently. Sarah is right where you used to stand that day. But now she sees dignity in every person who walks through that door, because that's what you taught us all. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Someone had hung Christmas lights around the workshop, their soft glow reflecting off the tools and wood shavings. The scene was humble but beautiful, like a prayer made visible. Robert held up the tiny rocking chair he'd finished, perfectly balanced and smooth. "Never thought these old hands could make something so delicate," he said, voice rough with emotion. "That's the thing about grace," Daniel replied, helping him add it to the growing collection of miniature furniture. "It shows up in the most unexpected ways." They worked through the morning, the pile of completed toys growing steadily. Each dollhouse took shape under careful hands, each tiny detail a testament to patience and pride in craftsmanship. The veterans shared stories as they worked, of battles fought, losses endured, and hope restored. Emily stayed, sorting donated Christmas decorations they'd used to dress the store windows. She hung a wreath on the workshop door, its pine scent mixing with the smell of fresh-cut wood and sweet cocoa. As noon approached, snow began falling outside, soft flakes drifting past the windows. The workshop grew quiet, everyone pausing to watch nature's gentle display. Daniel moved to the window, his reflection overlaying the winter scene beyond. He was still wearing that old jacket, now dusted with sawdust and bearing new memories. Looking around the room at the faces of friends who'd become family, at the beautiful things created by once broken hands, at the store that had transformed from a place of shame to a sanctuary of hope, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. His voice was soft but clear in the quiet room as he whispered, "Sometimes God wraps grace in secondhand clothes." Through the shop window, the falling snow transformed the world into something new and pure, while inside, the warm glow of love and redemption shone like a beacon in the winter morning. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Hayes, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.